Questions start off. Why did you decide to go into politics?
Well, it's a fairly recent decision, really. On the 1st of January 2006, I joined the Green Party after 20 odd years as a journalist. My first degree was agricultural science, and at that point I really just looked at the state of the world and thought, this is getting pretty scary, not just climate change, but also soil degradation, the damage to our water, the air, the whole state of the world. I thought I want to do something. So I joined the Green Party without any particular intentions in mind, just to do something. And here I am, 7 years later, leader of the Green Party. So it certainly wasn't a plan, it was just something that happened along the way. But it's, we make political decisions are made through Westminster, through Brussels, through our local councils. And I think it's really important that people who didn't necessarily start out and had their whole life's mission to do politics get involved and bring all their different experiences to it.
And obviously you're Australian.
And that's where the accent comes from.
Yeah. So were you involved in politics in Australia, or was it British politics that really took your fancy?
No, well, when I was in Australia as a young journalist, I worked around Australian country newspapers. And in the Australian countryside, you really have two sorts of politics. You have the Conservatives and the people who think that Conservatives are a bit soft and wussy and aren't really good enough on the death penalty. So there wasn't really much politics to get involved in the kind of places that I worked as a young journalist. And then I spent 5 years in Thailand, when a couple of years of that was working for the National Commission on Women's Affairs. So I was kind of, technically as a Thai civil servant, involved in politics, but obviously not in national Thai politics.
And do you find being, as far as I'm aware, the only party leader who isn't born and raised in Britain, do you find that difficult? Do you think that gives you an advantage, or maybe a different perspective on British politics?
Well, one thing I really notice is that many people have commented my accent is classless, which is quite useful, really, because it's just Australian. I'm not seen to come from any particular social grouping, and that's actually quite useful. And I think it's quite useful to just being a person who's had widely varied life experiences. That really is generally positive. And I've encountered the very occasional incidents of xenophobia, but not very many.
You mentioned working in women's affairs. How do you find it being a woman as a leader, as a party leader?
Well, I think one of the things that I think is terribly telling about British politics, indeed Anglo politics around the world, is the fact that when I took over for Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, last year as Green Party leader, it was the first time that a woman leader had taken over from another woman leader in British political history. And the fact that we had to get to 2013 to reach that point is really quite telling. We still have only 22% female MPs in Parliament. We have very few women actually making the decisions that run the country outside Theresa May. And I think that really is a problem. My first politics is feminism. That's really where I've worked all of my life. And I'm very passionate about getting more women involved in decision making, but also making sure that many women right at the bottom of society, women who are struggling to get by, we make things a little bit easier for them.
And you mentioned taking over from Caroline Lucas. I mean, how was that? Obviously, Caroline Lucas had got quite a high media profile. She still does have quite a high media profile. Are you nervous about taking over from her?
I think I wouldn't say nervous. It was really quite uncertain. It was very hard to know how it would work out. But actually, what we've really done for the Green Party is doubled our capacity. And actually, not long after I was elected, I was at York University, the Young Greens up there, and someone asked me as a question from the audience, the leaders, not the MPs, which was one of those questions that make you take a step back and think, oh, how do I answer that? But actually, there's a lot of positives in terms of that I'm not tied to Westminster, I'm not tied to a particular constituency. So, for example, I'm just finishing a run of 3 days in the West Country, and I've been visiting 2 or 3 places a day, getting to meet and talk to lots of people around the country. So I'm not actually Westminster focused, and I think that really is a positive.
Caroline Lucas's court date is set for next week for her arrest during the protests. How did you feel about that, and how do you feel that may have affected the country's perspective of the Green Party?
I think for those who don't know, what we're talking about is Caroline was arrested at a protest at Balcombe over fracking. And the Green Party has always believed that sometimes non-violent direct action is an essential step because people just don't hear what's the voice of the people otherwise. And that's what Caroline herself said after she'd been arrested. And I think we were getting a lot of attention on the issue of fracking and our opposition to fracking before Caroline was arrested. We were getting a lot more attention after she got arrested.
And is it, with Caroline being in Westminster, is it I mean, obviously you have aspirations. I think I read that you have aspirations on Westminster as well.
Yeah.
But you've mentioned the benefits of being a party leader not tied to Westminster. Do you think that will give a different dynamic if you're leader of the Green Party and in Westminster?
Well, I think we're not looking for a Westminster election until 2015, and what we're looking at first is the European Parliament elections next year. And that's for those elections, they're proportional representation, which means effectively every vote counts. And there was recently actually a poll that put the Green Party on 12% in terms of European voting intentions. Can't resist mentioning the Lib Dems were on 10%. But that 12% would allow us to leap from 2 MEPs to 6 MEPs in the European Parliament. And those 6 MEPs would be joining the 4th largest group in the European Parliament. So at the moment, as we're working very much on those European elections, I'm getting to travel around the country. Westminster elections, of course, will be much more focused in London, and the seat that I'm likely to stand in is in London, Holborn and St Pancras. And it has many advantages. That's where I live, it's where I've been a local campaigner, but it's also no corner of it will be more than 20 minutes from the Millbank studios of the BBC and Sky, so it's quite handy in terms of a national political campaign as well.
We've been seeing a lot of you on television.
Yeah, exactly.
So in your time as Green Party leader, what do you feel have been your big accomplishments? What are the things that you think have changed? What are the things that you think you might like to change?
I think what we're succeeding in doing is increasingly people are recognising that the Green Party is much more than an environmental party. There's 3, perhaps 4 big issues that I've really been running on very much, one of which is focusing on the fact that we need to make the minimum wage a living wage. If you work full time, you should earn enough money to live on. And that's part of a broader campaign about saying that we need jobs that you can build a life on. No forced casualisation, ban 0 hours contracts. Make sure that people can take a job that they know they can pay the rent, get enough food on the table, eventually even think about perhaps, getting a mortgage, buying a house, all of those sorts of things. So that's one of the big issues. The other one, which I'm very passionate about, spending a lot of my time on railways, is renationalising the railways. And that's something that pretty well every public meeting I've ever addressed, when I said we want to renationalise the railways, there is always a round of applause. And people are increasingly recognising that that's our policy that we're driving forward. And the other thing that's really become much more of a big issue, I'm really noticing in the last 3 or 4 months, is keeping the NHS public. We believe in a publicly owned and publicly run NHS. And I was in Bath last night. It's been a rather whirlwind tour. Bath last night, and the room just erupted when I said keep the NHS public, because people realise there is a real stealth privatisation going on. And then the one that I always mention in universities, which is 0 tuition fees. We believe in 0 tuition fees because we think education is public good. And young people really shouldn't be starting their lives with a great weight of debt sitting on their shoulder, that is likely to pursue large numbers of them for decades. And so I think what I've broadly achieved probably is getting more and more people to recognise us for those policies and as leading on those policies. And I think particularly the living wage, when I first started saying that, it was quite a new concept to people. And yet we've even got the Tory party now starting to talk about that a living wage would be quite a good idea. So, I think we're really managing to put some things on the political agenda and also getting people to recognise that we're about a lot more than the environment.
So if you've got these key policies, why do you think the Green Party hasn't made the same sort of inroads that UKIP had with these sort of similar flagship policies?
I might challenge these similar policies characterisation in terms of, UKIP, you can understand a number of reasons why UKIP is attractive. One of them being that a lot of UKIP voters are disillusioned Tories who think that the Tories are horribly incompetent in government, which is true, and they're not likely to go in a leftward direction, so they're looking to go right. There's a lot of people who look back to some golden age of the 1950s that they think existed and would like to go there. And UKIP also has what sounds like a superficially very simple message that looks attractive to some people. If we just get out of the EU and stop immigration, everything will be wonderful, sweetness and light. Now, if for us it's difficult, we understand that we need to entirely reform the British economy, bring manufacturing and food production back to Britain, create jobs you can build a life on based on small businesses and cooperatives and strong local economies. And that's not nearly so simple a message. And we understand that we have to live within the limits of the one planet. So we're still working on boiling our message down to something that's that simple and easy to understand. But as I said, we're scoring 12% in the polls for the European Union vote, and I think we can go forward. And in 2015, what will be really different about that election is that we will be a parliamentary party. We will, Caroline Lucas has been elected. Brighton Pavilion did it. That means any other seat in the country could, for a long time in Britain, two-party politics. People have often voted for the candidate they disliked the second most, so that the candidate that they disliked the most wouldn't get in. And that's given us the kind of politics we've got now. And I think we're at a point where people are ready to really look for something different.
Do you think that the Greens, or how would you respond to accusations that the Greens are a bit too idealistic and perhaps a little bit too vague in policies?
Well, I think I'd come back to the fact that so many of our policies, like renationalising the railways, has 75% public support. Public ownership of the NHS has like 90% plus public support. We're actually saying what many people understand to be common sense and sensible views. And there was a Fabian Society poll out a couple of weeks ago that I think was very interesting, because presented with a statement that said the British economic model is broken, 67% of British people agreed with that statement and only 15% disagreed. And that's what we're saying. We're saying the current model is broken. Globalisation, neoliberalism, all the privatisation of public services. We know this has failed. We have to absolutely change direction. And what we've seen in the past few decades, the direction of British politics, there's nothing inevitable about that. That happened because of Thatcherism, because we made decisions to privilege multinational companies over small companies. We made decisions to outsource everything in a way that basically just delivered public money into private hands, in a way that just cut workers' pay and conditions and cut the quality of services. Those were all decisions we've made in the past, but we can change those decisions and head in a new direction. And I think people really increasingly get that.
And just to finish off, you're here obviously to talk about fracking. What's the sort of key message that you'd like to give people that are coming to see you today?
Well, I think in terms of fracking, there's a couple of things I'd like to get across. There's obvious real concerns in terms of the local environmental impacts of fracking. You've got the certain ones. There'd be large numbers of HGV movements. You get large amount of disruption in the countryside. You've also got real risks in terms of contamination of water supplies, contamination of groundwater. And one of the things about underground water supplies, if you contaminate them, they're gone forever. You don't want to contaminate a lake or a river, but you can clean it up. If you've got deep underground aquifers, you can't clean them up. There's no way of doing that. But also there's a much broader issue, which is the fact that of our known fossil fuel reserves that we know about around the world, we know to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to leave at least half of them in the ground. So what we should be doing is not going out looking for new fossil fuel reserves, which is what fracking is. We actually should be looking at ways how we can manage the economic transition to leave that half of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. Because we've just had the report from the IPCC saying we are on the path to catastrophic climate change. We have to stop and change direction on that too. And that's, fracking is absolutely the wrong direction to be taking.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoy your talk later. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.